everyone. Welcome to the session on public education, racism, and community health, lessons from New Orleans. I'm just going to introduce our moderator and speaker, Phoebe Ferguson, and then the panel will kick it off. Phoebe Ferguson is the co-founder and executive director of the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation, a nonprofit organization inspired by the legacy of Homer Plessy, whose 1896 U.S. Supreme Court case sought to challenge racial segregation in Louisiana. Phoebe is a native New Orleanian and the great-great-granddaughter of Judge John Howard Ferguson, the named defendant in the landmark Plessy v. Ferguson case. In 2009, she co-founded the foundation with Keith Plessy, a descendant of Homer Plessy. Her work focuses on African American history, preservation, and racial justice. Her studies at Art Center College of Design, Tulane University, and New York University in sociology and documentary film enable her to meld racial justice activism and the arts. Her award-winning documentary, Member of the Club, tells the story of the rise of the Black middle class, history and cultural, 1895 to 2005 in New Orleans. For the past 2 decades, Phoebe has worked tirelessly to document the anti-democratic takeover of New Orleans public schools after Hurricane Katrina and the inequities experienced by African American youth and families. So thank you so much, Phoebe, for being here, and I'll turn things over to you.
Well, thank you so much, and good morning. And thank you to the Tulane School of Public Health for having us here today to talk about this important subject. When Keith Plessy and I realized that we could work together to turn verses into and, we had one main purpose in mind, and that was to honor the members of the legacy of Homer Plessy and the Citizens Committee for their commitment and sacrifices in decades-long pursuit of justice and equality. And long before the Separate Car Act made it illegal for blacks and whites to travel together in the same railroad car, black citizens in New Orleans fought for access to free public education for all, and for the Citizens Committee, this was the forefront of their fight. Our presentation, Public Education, Racism, and Community Health, Lessons from New Orleans, comes from a body of work that we have all created over the last almost 20 years. And my role has been that of documenting the community meetings, board meetings, interviews with parents and teachers, students, the struggle, the community struggle to have a say in the rebuilding of their public education system after Katrina. So what we'd like I want to introduce my colleagues. This is Dr. Raynard Sanders. He is also the chair of the board of the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation. We work together on education equity. And Dr. Kristen Burris. Both of my colleagues were born in New Orleans and are veteran educators, historians, community activists, and public school advocates. And they've both written extensively on the dismantling of the New Orleans public school system after Katrina. So please look them up to find they've each written a book and co-authored a book, and they've written extensively, articles in journals and newspapers. But for the last 20 years, they have been making the public aware of the harm that the charter school model can have on students and communities. So what we would like to do is, with their expertise, is to show you some of the video that we have been accumulating over the years. And unfortunately, we have so little time. We're going to show you the full episode of the first video, which will help you understand how this takeover took place on the state level and on the local level. And then from that point on, when we show some videos, they're going to be quite short, excerpts. But it will still give you a sense of what the community is feeling during the process. And I think that I have to be the one to do this. Yes. Okay. Yeah, so you can see a little bit more of their credentials there. But here we go. This is the title of the series is A Perfect Storm, the Takeover of New Orleans Public Schools. And it's sort of an ongoing video series. So this is number 1, part 1.
They are expecting some severe damage.
5 or 6 hours now of heavy rain to go along with that.
The Salvation Army plans to serve 400,000 in terms of figuring out how much.
While people in Orleans Parish were still underwater and on rooftops, there was a plan being formed to take away the schools in Orleans Parish.
The public should know that the Orleans Parish School Board was pressured by the state education officials to start charter schools.
Superintendent Picard clearly stated to me and several other board members that he didn't want schools to open unless they opened as charter schools.
The state, when they took over 107 schools, did not have a plan to open the schools. Matter of fact, they didn't want to open them. Mr. Picard is quoted as saying he had no intentions of opening the regular schools. He wanted charter groups from around the country to open the school.
Of course, we found out later on that he had been working with the governor, or the governor at some point, I'm not sure if it was October of that year, signed the executive order, which basically removed all of the kind of requirements to become a charter school in terms of community and faculty and parent vote related to that, so which made charter schools basically able to happen almost overnight.
Discussion was being had by several Bessie members led by Leslie Jacobs on how can we take the schools? How can we get this district that's now on its knees, scrambling to stay alive, and kill it? Just kill it, the coup de grace. We have finally got an opening that would have taken us 40 or 50 years of back and forth and forth and back. It has been handed to us. How do we do that? Well, declare the district an academic crisis.
In the state capitol, there was another law being passed called Act 35.
17 days in November. At first, we all thought that the 17-day session was going to be reconstruction of New Orleans, housing, and things like that. When it became set with the takeover, complete takeover of the New Orleans school system and readjusting existing law that would only be targeted at New Orleans, then you saw it was something totally different.
The dirty deed in Act 35 is that the state changed the definition of what a failing school was so that it would bring in more schools than it had ever brought into the recovery school district.
No longer was a failing school with a performance score less than 60. A failing school got to be a school with a performance score less than the state average of 87.4. It definitely targeted New Orleans. I mean, it targeted New Orleans. New Orleans was the only school system that was taken over by Act 35.
Really, it could have bankrupted the school board, because what it did was then removed the bulk of schools away from Orleans Parish School Board. And just to put it in economic terms, if we don't have the buildings, then we can't have students. And if we don't have students, then we don't have money.
The takeover was to be a massive experiment in improving the schools.
I thought the goal was to just create new schools, innovative schools that work for our children, whether they're charter schools or not. A lot of money has come into New Orleans to open up new schools. That actually incentivizes school failure. The more schools fail, the more money certain organizations can get to open new schools. They give no thought to what closing a school does to a child. Closing a school just simply starts the money changing hands again.
After 7 years and millions of dollars, and the Recovery School District of New Orleans, when you look at all the school districts, is at the bottom, just like the New Orleans Public School District was at the bottom on the date of the hurricane, August 29, 2005.
Okay, so that video gives you an idea of the strategies that were happening between August 29th and January 2006. And I'd like Ray to address this a little bit because Dr. Sanders was here during this period of transition. And if you could talk a little bit about what that was like and what you understood to be happening.
Sure. Just to bring a little clarity to it, the charter schools that were created after Katrina here in the city are not the typical charter schools that you find across the country. And these particular charter schools that they opened up were more about profit than about children. They basically opened the door and began to hire people who were not teachers. They gave the schools to anyone who had any experience. If you had no experience, you really had a plus if you came to New Orleans and you were white and you wanted to start a new business. If you were a failed used car salesperson, you could very well come down here and start a school. But the thing that happened in New Orleans with publication, as in other arenas like the criminal justice systems and the hospital systems, is that there was a move in New Orleans once Katrina came, and we became the first city in America to depopulate. We lost our tax base in about 3 hours. And what it told us was that the people that basically make the decisions in most cities, the 1%, what exactly they valued. And what they valued was to remove democracy, not just from public education, but from other arenas, as I mentioned earlier. Equally as important, to take away the power of public participation. So the charter schools here do not answer to the local community board. They answer to a self-appointing board, and they are not held accountable to anything. But we not only saw that in education, and we're going to talk about public health, equity, and those kinds of things, and kind of connect those dots. But we also saw that in the criminal justice system, the closing of the hospital, the closing of public housing. Some of the public housing here did not flood as a result of Katrina, and what they did was they boarded up the people's houses and would not let them return. And they really wanted to get rid of poor black people, okay? And so it really becomes a case study for America, is that what happens in a city when you have to start over? Do you care about everyone, or do you just care about a few people? And do you dismiss the people that have built this city and eliminate them from public space and from the public process? So when we talk about this takeover, it is not something that is just isolated to public education here in New Orleans. So we are still, in many ways, not only in public education, we're cutting a road through the forest, because no other city in America has been through this in modern times. And we'll get into a little bit more detailed about, you know, the takeover and its effects and how it devastated the black middle class, in particular African American, black and brown children.
As I recall, one of the most egregious things that the state did during this fall period was to fire all of the teachers while they were still out of town. Can you talk about that a little bit, Kristen?
Sure. So when Katrina hit, the vast majority of teachers in New Orleans public schools were black veteran educators. They had been teaching in the classrooms for 20 or 30 years. They were a significant portion of this city's black middle class, a significant portion of homeowners, and really community leaders. And what happened is, as a part of this profiteering scheme that was instituted here by local, state, and federal leaders and various philanthropies, was this idea of scapegoating black teachers for the failure of New Orleans public schools. And what happened is there was a real separation between the history of racism in this city and why the schools were struggling as they did. But rather than addressing the history of racism, which is what the Plessy and the Citizens Committee were trying to do, right? They instead scapegoated black teachers as failing students, not knowing how to teach, not caring, etc. And then simultaneously with the mass firing of these teachers, brought in through Teach for America and other education businesses, young people with college degrees but no required background in education to teach in classrooms. While black teachers, right, were struggling to come back to the city, homes and neighborhoods were destroyed, but they were committed to coming back. Simultaneous with this, it came out in various court proceedings because these teachers sued regarding their wrongful termination, that while they're trying to rebuild with very few resources and been fired, right, they were giving $17,000 and $18,000 stipends to these inexperienced, largely white teachers from outside the community to come and work in the classrooms with black youth in this city. And so it was a real project of disenfranchisement of these teachers who were rooted in the community and who were perhaps one of the major stabilizing forces for these young black people.
Let me just try to connect the importance of public schools and health, okay? So historically, public schools have played a very important role into the health of the community, particularly black and brown kids. So all of us, when we entered kindergarten, the first encounter that our parents had before we entered school was to make sure we have shots, okay? So the school really not only provided that initial importance of that, but throughout the history, it also addresses students with special needs, kids that come to school being abused, child protection, and all of those things. And they recommend to parents who may or may not get to a doctor things that they should do, mental counseling and those kinds of things. So the school really becomes the voice of reason, the voice of logic. In New Orleans, when we did the takeover, it deprofessionalized all of that. So therefore, that safety net and that the services that public schools have historically provided no longer exist here. So we have a superintendent who's basically stated we don't need counselors. We have these individual charter schools that don't have counselors, don't have nurses. So that important advice, that important guidance that have historically happened in public education since the beginning of public education no longer exist. And so the phrase that is in school district policies across the country for the welfare of the children, in addition to the 3 R's, does not exist here in New Orleans, in the city with about 88% African American and a largely very, very poor population. So this connection is not the main focus of public education, but as you all well know as health educators, the place where people can get help, whether it's health and other social services, is in our public schools. And with the deprofessionalization that Kristen just talked about, that guidance does not happen here in the city of New Orleans.
And historically, in the 19th century, black neighborhoods had to fight to have a school in their neighborhood at all. And in so doing, that school then became the center for all things that address community needs, and also where they trained educators and had all the, medical services. So this is something that has been going on for, a century of black education in New Orleans. And we're gonna just sort of back up a little bit and show you 30 seconds of about the mass firing of teachers, and then we'll continue.
So when I come back in the fall of '06 as an administrator, the Recovery School District would send you candidates to interview. They had not taught at all. Their background was not in education. One day they would be there, and then the next day they would decide that this is not what they contracted to do. But they were given an opportunity to come in to be employed. We have to have people that the students can relate to. Not only relate to, but they can teach.
So when teachers return, despite having certifications, master's degrees, years of experience, all of a sudden the ball game changed. And all of that stems from a whole total disenfranchisement of the local population, and that we are not intelligent enough to govern ourselves, and that they have to govern us.
The main point here in the efforts to take over the schools was to do it without any of the veteran teachers that had dedicated their lives to these students. And so when the students came back, their houses were gone, their schools were gone, and their teachers were gone. And they came back to a foreign education system. But at this moment, early 2007, as we imported teachers and certain models of education, students were traumatized. They were absolutely traumatized. Their parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles were scattered across the United States. Parents were trying to get back, and they knew they had to get their kids in school. So for those who did come back, we'd like to show you an example of one of the first charter schools to open in New Orleans in 2007. And in this case, I was actually invited to film at this school for several days so that they could use the footage to see how their model was working on the kids.
Adversity reveals character. It's part of life. A lot of you have struggled. When you have challenges, it shows who you are. How you respond, how you rebound, how you act. Are you a scholar or not? Can you handle it, or will you break?
The label No Excuses describes this group of high-achieving, high-discipline charter schools. They've become very popular because they have been shown to improve test scores of low-income students, minority students. But they've been controversial as well because they use a very prescriptive disciplinary approach.
Those of you that show any sign of disrespect to your teachers, any playing around, any rolling of the eyes, any smacking of the teeth, attitude, we reserve the right to give you automatic detentions for that this week. Also with a phone call home and a conference between me and your parents.
There's only 4 ways that people learn, period. You learn from curiosity, observation, mistakes, and experience. And if you're in a classroom setting and your curiosity is not afforded an opportunity to flourish, then automatically it makes you hold things in. And if you're holding things in over a period of time, it becomes stressful.
You try, but the standards are kind of too high and you can't meet them. And you don't feel supported by your teachers to meet them because they seem like disciplinarians who are always critical of you. So it eventually, if you feel like you're striving and you're just not cutting it, you're going to sort of start to disengage or give up.
When children are identified by their test scores, it becomes possible to see them as less than human, and it makes it easier to impose regulations that become inhumane.
So just before we talk about that, I'm going to show you 30 seconds of what a veteran teacher's classroom looks like, or looked like before Katrina.
Is that a timeline you're making? Yeah, that's smart. Is that right? No, so he wasn't doing that.
Well, we're going to change it one at a time. That's right. Is it right now? Just keep changing one at a time. Then we'll be.
Let's see. I can tell you whether or not you've solved the mystery. Okay. I can't say which questions. You have not solved the mystery.
Oh.
Okay.
So what you just saw was the no excuse model, which is harsh disciplinary system. And you saw the kids at Walter Coyne with the yellow shirts on, and they were basically talking to them like they were prisoners, getting them ready for prison. You also need to understand that of the about 78 schools we have, about 60 of our schools utilize some form of this. And this is mostly the kids that don't get into the academically enhanced schools. So the majority of kids go through this no excuse model where instead of the classroom being places where kids learn and engage ideas, they basically want them to be compliant, right? You saw a word yet on the board when the guy was talking. And you know, if a student came in and if he rolled his eyes at the teacher, they would put the kid in a corner and put a sign on him saying yet, that you're not ready yet. So unfortunately, while the charter schools initially were a great idea, this modified charter system that is spreading across the country that affect most of the kids here in New Orleans have nothing to do with teaching and learning, have more to do with making them compliant, not servicing them, not treating them as individuals. You know, we had one school with more security guards than teachers, has not really served us well in addition to the failure. Kristen has been doing some extensive work in upcoming book to talk about this no excuse model and its effect on children.
I think it was clear, right, seeing the video, you can see the vibrancy and the dialogue and interactions between that Black veteran teacher and the students, right? There was a sense of, you heard laughter, or a sense of engagement in the classroom, and then you saw the no excuses where kids looked sort of dispossessed, right? Bored and just disconnected from the school environments around them.
Depressed even.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just beaten down.
You know, and this is what I found. I you know, spoke with students and families who were involved in one of the charter school networks here in New Orleans, and it was heartbreaking to talk to the young kids because, you know, I had teenagers crying over their experience. Things like, you know, a young woman who had been suspended 62 times in a single year. And actually, this particular network that I studied at one point in New Orleans had a suspension rate of 70%, meaning that every child in the school had been put out at least once that year, many more than that. And for very trivial things. We're not talking about kids who are acting out in a violent way. We're talking about not following absurd disciplinary rules like, did you raise your hand at a 90-degree angle? Did you forget to wear your belt today? Did you not walk on the line that's in the hallway? And so—
With your hands behind your back.
Yes. These schools are silent places, which clearly, as health professionals, you sort of know what constitutes youth health, right? And it's certainly not this. And I think to build on something that Renard said that's key to understand is that, you know, the criminalization and disciplinary model that you see in these no excuses charter schools leads to certain kind of resource investment. So rather than investing in things like, let's get nurses, let's get counselors, let's have arts programs, all these things that we know promote youth engagement, health, and well-being. Instead, it's exactly as Renard and Phoebe pointed out, you see a proliferation of security guards in the schools. You see metal detectors and things like this. And so it really creates an environment of dis-ease, right, for the students. And then if you think about the suspension and expulsion rates that you're seeing because of this disciplinary model, you're talking about young people being, and this has all been documented in various civil rights complaints, young people being put on the street in the middle of the day, suspended without their parents even being notified that they've left school, which is clearly unlawful. Kids being deprived of lunch, of food, if they refuse to show up for lunchtime detention. And the list of offenses goes on. And I'm not talking about the kids' offenses, I'm talking about those of the charter operators. And so all of these things contribute to, you know, a long-term trajectory of ill health. When kids aren't in school, when they're roaming the streets, they're more likely to get into trouble because they haven't been offered something more positive and constructive to do.
You know, and I think it's important because as we speak, there are several organizations out here that have accumulated a lot of money to spread this model to other cities. Particularly, they are targeting urban areas. And the reason why they the reason why they targeted us, not only because of urban area, because we had this catastrophic event. And so there was an opening to do it. But they're particularly targeting urban areas, one called the City Fund. They've raised about $200 million, led by the biggest contributor is the guy who has Netflix. And they want to spread this model to 10 cities across the country, okay? So, you know, we're going to talk a little bit, I think we got a few minutes left, about the academic issue, but for what you guys are here for is that schools play such an important role in the health and well-being of a child's life. And if we if we have this model to spread, where we disenfranchise the public, and we no longer offer those services to kids, then a lot of kids are going to be swept by the wayside and going to fall out because of one health issue or another health issue. And, you know, this is the southeastern part of the United States, and, you know, we rank 48 and 49th in everything as relates to children, right? Not just academics, but particularly health, low birth rate, everything. You know, we rank low in. We were the largest city in the state with a majority minority population. And now our public education system refuses, because this is a choice. We have some schools that are doing it, but it's a minority. But they should refuse to provide the safety net and provide those kinds of services that historically have happened across the country, in which many of you all have benefited from, are familiar with as health educators. So, you know, not only is this connection is important, but also our concern as a country that is largely becoming minority, largely becoming black and brown kids. And we have a very aggressive, well-financed movement to disenfranchise them, those communities, and also to take away the needed help that comes through public schools in terms of helping kids and families through the crisis that they may confront themselves with. So, you know, the academics, extremely important, but the role that the school plays becomes vital, you know, in terms of special needs services, in terms of family counseling.
Talk about the relationship of the history and identification that neighborhoods had with their neighborhood schools.
Well, yeah, well, you know, like
legacy.
Yeah, like most communities, people rally around the school. Becomes a sense of ownership, becomes like the church, okay? I mentioned earlier that it is a voice of reason. It's somewhere where people can say, in the community, can say, well, we're gonna go and see what the school says. And parents will come into the school and ask questions, have nothing to do with public education, but that is the voice of reason. That is the identity, right? So pre-Katrina, you know, we had these communities that were, you know, were long established, just like places where you're from, where people identified with that school, had an allegiance and a commitment to that school, still wearing T-shirts, have alumni and those kinds of things. Post-Katrina, we no longer have neighborhood schools. The kids are put on buses and ride for 2 hours to get to their school. We can have a parent with 3 siblings that'll be in 3 different schools, right? So the whole sense of community ended. That whole sense of ownership ended. The firing of the teachers and the relationships that they had ended. So you can't say enough about the role that schools play in functionable communities. So every functionable community in America, regardless of the income that they have, has a good school, has a school that people are proud of. Might be unhappy with them on some days, but generally, we are really, really happy and proud of our school, the Vikings or the Bulldogs or those kinds of things. Well, in this new model, in this new education reform model, that doesn't exist. Our communities don't exist anymore. Those alliances don't exist. Our historic institutions, the school I went to, which is an historic African-American school, that no longer exists. Right?
Could I interject really quickly, just to give one brief comparison to illuminate what Renard is talking about? I told you that I talked to some of the students in the charter school network, right, and about their experiences. But the other thing I didn't tell you is I also interviewed and did an oral history study of an all-black high school that had existed for 50 years before Katrina struck. And so I got to see what the schools were like with the black veteran teachers who were community-based for 50 years before Katrina, and then to talk to students about what the schools were like after. So just one quick comparison, right? So, for example, one of the students who graduated from the historic all-black school talked about how teachers would seek scholarships for students, right? There were reports of how, you know, the teachers knew the families, right? One teacher talked about, I taught parents and then I taught their children. So when they came in, I was teaching my grandchildren, right? That sense. of investment. On the other hand, the students in the charter network reported just the opposite, right? For example, I mean, the most perhaps egregious thing I heard was a young woman who had a dear friend of hers, a peer, who had been shot the night before. And she showed up at school, her missing part of her uniform, and was immediately sort of disciplined by the principal. And she said, I apologize, I really didn't sleep, I had a friend who got shot, and he did not care. He disciplined that student despite the traumatic event that she had been through. And so these kinds of comparisons of the culture before and the culture after really illuminate, I think, health and unhealth in a really powerful way.
One thing that we really have to get in here is one of the pillars, or the main pillar that the reform model is built on, and that is school choice. And so the reason that our kids are now being bused from one end of the city to the other is under the guise of having school choice, that you no longer are forced to go to your neighborhood failing school. And so that, the other thing is that charter schools are just that. They're a charter contract. Their mandate is to reach, for their students to reach a certain grade average in the first 3 years. If that doesn't happen, they can close that school down and hand it off to another operator. And it can also be shut down if there are incidents of fraud or mismanagement. And I can't even begin to tell you the number of schools that have now, I should actually be able to tell you that, it's at the end of this video, closed down since Katrina, and the effect that a school closing has on children. And that is something that, you know, it seems like no one thought to think about what that would actually mean. The changing of schools in the middle of the year, the teachers, the young teachers with no experience, they were traumatized. You know, they came to help, but they were thrown into a situation with no support and no expertise and thousands of traumatized kids. And they began to leave because there just wasn't, they felt helpless. Okay. So this is a very short clip just showing the aftermath of one school closing on a family, on a couple of families.
Today is a day that no parent or child should have to experience. No parent and no child should be forced out of their school.
You know what my kids are gonna say? Well, I went to 4 years of different elementary schools by the time I made it to 6th grade. What kind of model for education is that?
That just, you know, speaks for itself, I think. This graphic is 2019, and it shows that in 2019 alone, we lost 900 teachers in Orleans Parish. And so you can imagine what the teacher turnover does, and also in all of these schools, they do not have teachers for every subject. And so it is very chaotic, and there are many stories about that. I am going to show you just the last short video on a little bit of choice and school failure academically, and then we can open it up to questions. But there's probably still so much more.
Before you click, the only thing I think that we should point out is that, you know, these schools, every year the state rates the charter schools based on a compendium of information that they collect, right? And it's important for you to understand that after almost 20 years of experimentation on the backs of the Black community in this city, the majority of charter schools in New Orleans are rated C, D, or F by the state.
Mostly D and F.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you're good.
Okay. Yeah, so we call this the illusion of choice because
There's so many people coming to New Orleans wanting to help with the reform of our public education system, but they didn't come in here and ask us what we wanted. They came in here with their preconceived ideas of what they thought education reform was about before they took the time to get to know us, what our concerns were about our public schools.
Don't send me a charter school that doesn't want to hear what we have to say. We are involved in our children's education. You already shut down my alma mater, and I'm not going to stand here and let you shut down Sarah T. Reed. So let's stand here together and demand that they give us local control.
There is no failing school. The policies are failing. The policies have failed.
If the only choice is failing school A, failing school B, or failing school C, as a parent, I'm disenfranchised. We have all of these charters and we have, like 40-something school systems operating independently, and they don't work together. You don't get but one shot at raising children. I can't wait till you get this straight and then bring my child back for kindergarten. The day I enroll him in kindergarten, that's the only first day of school he's gonna ever have.
Okay. So would you like to talk about anything a little bit more? Do you have questions?
The mic is...
There is a mic available. It will be put in the center of the room, and we would love it if you would come to this, or over here where Greta is attaching the mic.
And also we'll do virtual too.
Yes. We will also, just so you know, there will be possibly questions coming in from our virtual audience.
Good morning,
Good morning.
wonderful
Good morning.
people, for an amazingly searing presentation. So I work on my name is Vernice Miller-Travis, and I work on the nexus of environment, race, and health. And I wonder if anyone in this process of taking over the schools paid any attention to the trauma that living through a hurricane as devastating as Katrina set in the souls of these children. That has to be processed, and it affects everything that happens to them from then on. So I see what they tried to do with the system, which was to build a different system than the one that existed, and to take out the sort of authentic historic nature of the school system here, but I didn't hear anybody say anything about the public health dimensions of what these children had been through and the physical conditions of the schools and the communities in which they were now going through. There's still parts of the Ninth Ward that look like the hurricane happened this past September, as opposed to September of 2005. So I'm just wondering if you are aware of any attention in any way that was paid to the psychosocial dimensions of what these children had lived through.
We are aware that efforts were made and suggestions was made, just as you said about trauma very early on. There was a couple of national associations that came, and all of that was ignored. So all of the funds that we got post-Katrina, and in addition to the regular funds that we got, Louisiana got $753 million to recover from Katrina. And as people were saying about trauma, about other things, about family counseling and those kinds of things, they took that money and put it in other places and gave it as, created these high salaries. The average, we don't pay a lot per pupil expenditure. So right after Katrina, we spent about $10,000 or $13,000 per child normally. In the New Orleans, we were spending $22,000 a child, and they refused to even address that, much like what we talked about earlier, how they did not address the welfare of the children. So yes, that was brought up, and it was basically ignored because, as you saw from the video, we were taken over by the state, and the state ran it like, without any public input.
So can I ask, as educators?
Could I add something? Because I do want to hold up the things that Black veteran teachers tried to do. Yes. So there were instances where teachers were trying to address these issues because they knew at a visceral level, right, that kids were experiencing all these things. So just one illustration is a program that was created by a Black veteran educator in New Orleans named Amelie Prescott. And she started something called the Mose Chukma Institute. This was at the King Elementary School in the lower 9th Ward. And it was basically trying to weave arts toward sort of resilience, right? And she did all kinds of meditational things with young people, and she used art. For example, one thing they did was before and after. So they did sort of boxes of, used different materials to decorate shoe boxes of what their neighborhoods like when Katrina hit, and then they did dream boxes of what they wanted how they wanted their neighborhoods to be rebuilt. And there's a teacher on a film that was made about this program called Transcendent Dreams, where you see the teacher talk about the emotive changes that she saw in students through their participation in this program, that they began to open up. The kids were able to talk about pets they lost, aunts and uncles that they lost who drowned in the floodwaters, and that this helped them. It lifted a burden from them. But these were just independent initiatives. As Renard pointed out, there was no systematic investment in addressing the trauma that children and families had been through. And there's no doubt, I'm not sure it's been measured in the way that it should, but there's no doubt it's being carried and manifesting in all kinds of ill health, long-term illness, because it just compounded the toxic stress that these communities are already under. Katrina just compounded that, and it never went addressed.
And that was going to be my follow-up question. Does anybody know or have tracked, how it has affected them and manifested? And what's been the dropout rate? Has anyone measured that pre and post?
Go ahead, and I'll talk about dropout.
Oh, okay. Now I forgot what I was going to say. There have been, in preparing for this, I tried to find some studies on the effect of the charter school system and trauma on these kids, and I couldn't find any. There have been very few studies that address the trauma aspect of the takeover and because now we have, almost 20 years into it, we should be able to have data on that.
In regards to enrollment, as you well know, enrollment is basically kept dropouts, right? For obvious reasons. In these charter schools, they gave them full autonomy now. So they act as independent school district. So we have no centralized enrollment. With that being said, when kids drop out, the schools are self-reporting, and they don't want to report a dropout because it hurts their ratings, right? So we found in some surveys that was done by the local media where they just pulled randomly some students' cumulative folder, and they were saying that the kid was moved out of the state when actually the kid dropped out. So once again, we right back to this welfare of the children. And this system is not designed for academic achievement, providing healthy, the kind of traditional things at public schools. It's about control and controlling resources. So the dropouts are like off the chain, and so is juvenile crime.
And I think to add, that control, there's no getting around the racial politics of it, right? It was even evident in the No Excuses video that Phoebe made. This is about, to put it bluntly, on the whole, white people seizing control of public schools, for their own profiteering purposes and making money off the backs of black kids. You know, and that may sound crass, but that's what it is. And when you have that kind of profit motive and that kind of racism driving public education, you're not going to come out with positive health effects for obvious reasons. So I think at the core of all of our work as educators and public health activists, we have to address in a central way issues of racism.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Good morning. My name is Robert Hines. I'm with the Louisiana Department of Health. And I had a comment and a question. So my comment is I am not from New Orleans. I live here, but I consider it my second home. I became an adult here. I went to Xavier University. I went to Tulane University as well. And the reason I consider it my second home is because I would never consider living here and raising a family here. And one of the reasons why I hesitate to even consider that is exactly the things that you showed in this video, which is how the public school system seems to attack black children, in my opinion. And so my question is, I was wondering, has anybody looked at the economic toll? Maybe that can move some people that may take place because of this, with people like me who will refuse to move here and invest resources into the communities because we see it as a threat to being able to raise productive, healthy, well-balanced children.
You know, it's interesting that you would say that. So I was in here earlier today. Before anybody got here, I got here early. And a gentleman walked in, and he went to Warren Easton High School, one of our local high schools. And he was talking to the guys in the back. And he mentioned to them that he moved out of the parish and how happy he is for the same reason that you talked about, right? So I'm a former middle school principal, high school principal, and I have always promoted public schools. I really have reservations about that now. I have, particularly if you have a child with special needs. You know, in answer to your, could you repeat that question? I kind of forgot a little bit.
That's okay. No, I was just wondering, had anyone looked at the economic toll that could possibly be taking place by people not investing or living here because of the school system?
Let me state this, and we didn't mention this. During the mass fire, 7,500 employees were dismissed. 7,500 middle-class, livable wage jobs. About 5,500 of those was African American. We will never recover from that. The middle class is like devastated, okay? But what we can, and you know, whether there's a formal study, you know, we do know that what is not has been, you know, like put in any quantifiable kind of way, but we do know that those people are not here anymore, right? Or they retired or whatever. But we have made a lot of millionaires. And the salaries have gone up. The high school, take for instance, if you're in a public school in Louisiana and you're a high school principal, you might make about 90 grand, right? Well, when they started these charter schools, you know, 18 years ago, you were an elementary school principal with 200 kids, you made 150 grand, right? So these people are making like $250,000. So I think we're on our second or third generation of creating millionaires that don't look like us generally.
With very little money left in the coffers for education.
Yeah, for social services and those kinds of things.
Right.
We are pretty much at time. If we have one quick question, we can end with that, and then we will wrap it up.
Hi, I'm Riley Fidewa, and I am a master's student here at Tulane. I consider myself a transplant. I just live here while I'm continuing my education, but I love the community here, and I always want to know how I can contribute. I have a loud voice, and I like to be active and be an activist. So what are things like that I can do on an individual level, and also just was curious about ongoing policy change directed to help New Orleans public school system?
Well, there's several organizations. One of you I check called the Plessy Ferguson Foundation. I do need to mention that, but there are other organizations that are working more specifically about education. There are the black social workers that are dealing a lot with the social services and health agencies too. And if you leave your contact information, we can send you those names, particular of those organizations you may want to share anything else.
Absolutely.
Thank
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, we can give our panel a round of applause.
Thank you.